Hi, Kathy here again. You're probably all looking to see if you're in the right lecture. I'm sure you've noticed that this class has been extremely Eurocentric for many weeks now because of our focus on the Renaissance and then the Baroque. We've really concentrated on Europe. We did take a quick look at what was happening globally during the Gothic millennium, just to give some background for looking at the Renaissance. But other than that, we haven't really gone abroad from Europe yet. And of course, we've now reached the point where Europeans were themselves starting to go abroad. From the 1400s on, Europe was becoming much more connected with the rest of the world. Much of that connection was exploitative colonialism, and as we'll see, that frequently had fairly devastating effects on the regions Europe connected with, and sometimes effects on the art of those regions as well. But we'll start with the Americas today. I'm sure many of you have heard of Machu Picchu. Machu Picchu was an Incan site in the remote mountains of Peru, high above the Urubamba River. It predates contact with the Spanish explorers who would conquer and pretty much destroy Incan and Aztec culture over the next couple of hundred years. This is certainly one of the most amazing archaeological sites in the world. At this gorgeous spot, 9,000 feet above sea level, just the effort expended on building it would be enough to make it one of the amazing wonders of the world. Scholars generally believe it was designed as a royal estate and used by at least two great Incan rulers before it was abandoned in 1532. At the height of its use, about 750 people would have lived there when the ruler was in residence, with the smaller permanent staff staying there year-round. Its mysterious abandonment in 1532 corresponds with the beginning of the Spanish conquest of Peru. The Spaniards never came to Machu Picchu, but the smallpox, which they introduced to the New World, is very likely the enemy that turned it into a desolate ruin. This Incan woven textile from around 1550 shows that they had a well-developed tradition of elaborate weaving. Fine cloth was valued even more than precious metal in the Inca culture. In fact, gold and silver, called by the Incas the sweat of the sun, the tears of the moon, were valued as much for their spiritual properties as for their economic worth. Alas, the conquering Spaniards did not share this view. Their records describe much of the incredible gold and silver art they found more in terms of its weight than its beauty. It was largely melted down into ingots for transport back to Spain. A few examples that were somehow hidden away still remain to us. This beautiful silver alpaca from the 15th century. This would have been produced right about the same time as the Quattrocento was going on in Italy. A 16th century chronicler described gardens entirely made out of gold and silver, which the conquistadors found in the royal palace. And this is a quote: "They planted all the beautiful and pleasing trees, beds of fragrant and beautiful flowers that there were in that kingdom. Among these and other great things they made corn plants, counterfeiting nature with their leaves, cobs, and stalks, with their roots and flower. And the hairs that the cob puts out were of gold, and all the rest of silver, soldered one to another. There were also small and large animals imitated and cast of gold and silver. There were all kinds of birds, some placed among the trees as if they sang, others as if they were flying and sucking the honey from the flowers. There were venomous snakes and fallow deer, lions and tigers, and all the other animals and birds that grow in that land, each thing in its place, in order to better copy nature." Needless to say, those gardens disappeared into the maw of Spain, hungry for gold. Just a few stalks of maize have survived, to give a hint of what those gardens must have looked like before Pizarro arrived in 1532. Just to the north, in Mexico, a similar fate had befallen the Aztec culture. The Spanish conquistadors defeated their empire and largely destroyed their culture. Here are some examples of their artwork that remain to us. This nearly life-size ceramic eagle warrior representing an elite class of soldier in the Aztec army. This double-headed serpent is covered with mosaic pieces made of turquoise. And this sculpture, widely considered one of the finest remaining examples of Aztec sculpture, represents a particularly scary goddess. She's nearly 12 feet tall and wearing a skirt of entwined snakes and a necklace of human hands and hearts, as well as a skull pendant. She leans forward a bit, and the effect is so terrifying that the sculpture was apparently reburied several times after it was first discovered and excavated in 1790. When the Spaniards conquered the area that's now Mexico, their aggressive missionary efforts spread Roman Catholicism very quickly, and this resulted in some interesting artwork that absorbs some Aztec symbolism into Christian symbolism. This large, early colonial cross became a traditional component of many Mexican churches under the missionaries. They were called atrial crosses because they were located in the atrium of a church, where large numbers of new converts would gather for education and the propagation of the new faith. The missionaries had them carved by indigenous Aztec sculptors, and although the symbols of Christ's passion, the blood, the nails, the sign reading INRI appear, initials of the Latin phrase which translates to Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. All those symbols of Christ's passion were learned from the missionaries, of course, but the style in which they are sculpted reminds me more of that goddess statue we just looked at than any European crucifix. Cortez defeated the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma in 1521. Pizarro conquered the Incas in 1532. Both events occurred during the reign of the Spanish King Charles I. The destruction of the great pre-Columbian civilizations brought fabulous wealth to Spain. This map shows not just the trade routes in brighter green, but the general direction of capital flow from these arrows, a little harder to see. And you can see here that the direction of the capital flow is going from the Americas to Spain. Spain is getting very rich from Central and South America. Spain's next king, Philip II, spent some of that wealth employing Sofonisba Anguissola as his court portrait painter, remember? Under Philip III, Spain's fortunes declined a bit, but by the time of Philip IV, there was still plenty of money left to employ Velázquez. Just giving you some context here. Art takes money, and this is where Spain's money came from in that period, lest we forget. Ships were bringing not just melted Aztec and Incan gold, but exotic creatures, animals, and other products from the Americas as well. Remember the parrots and the conch shells, the citrus fruits of this Pronk still life by Duhame that we looked at last week? These exotic objects came directly from the Americas and were becoming part of high culture as status symbols in the paintings of Europe. Here's a fairly chilling example of the Pronk still life. Here, an African slave is depicted among the exotic fruits, vases, and tapestry to add to the feeling of wealth and luxury. The slave trade was also growing, and had been, since Pope Nicholas V issued the Romanus Pontifex of 1455, which affirmed Portugal's exclusive rights to territories it claimed along the West African coast. Portugal was granted the right to invade, plunder, and, quote, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, end quote. By the end of the 18th century, 100,000 people a year were being captured and sold out of Africa. Remember Juan de Pareja, the assistant of Velázquez? He was a slave. Velázquez freed him shortly after painting this portrait, in fact, but only after decades of slavery. The Spanish, the Dutch, the French, the British, and eventually the United States all took part in the Atlantic slave trade. But since the Portuguese were the first, we'll look at Benin on Africa's west coast. Papal edict in hand, the Portuguese showed up on the west coast of Africa, showed up in Benin in 1489, looking for gold. Benin had no gold, but they did have slaves, war captives to start with, and Portugal was happy to trade for them. This ivory waist pendant, which was worn by an Oba or king of Benin, shows him at the center, standing on the head of the sea god with fish swimming out of his nostrils, the sea god's nostrils, not the king's. The sea was the source of the king's wealth, since it brought overseas trade to Benin, but it was also the source of the country's depopulation and impoverishment. Benin had a highly developed metal casting industry, but a scarcity of metal ore. Brass was one of the things that the Portuguese traders could provide in exchange for slaves. Here is an 18th century sculpture of a Portuguese trader created in the brass which he might have brought to Benin himself. Colonialism was a tragedy for the colonialized world. That's true. It's tempting to despise this Portuguese trader or the Dutch householders who wanted paintings like this one as status symbols. It's perhaps important to remember that the very places where the Dutch East India Company was trading for some of these exotic vases are now the places where Americans' designer athletic shoes and clothing and cell phone ingredients are coming from. And the labor practices which provide us with these status symbols are in many places akin to slavery. On that depressing note, let's turn to the East. Japan had not been colonialized. After being very closed off from any contact with the West, Japan was just now opening up to European traders and missionaries. This beautiful screen by Tawaraya Sotatsu, Waves at Matsushima. This would be about the time of the late Baroque period in Europe. This painting really is all about the waves, and there's no attempt or interest in showing the deep space artists were obsessed with on the other side of the world. Some of the land areas here are left perfectly flat. The two panels comprise one big composition. Let's zoom in so you can see the beautiful, delicate, intricate patterning of the waves and the flow of the water. I also have some simpler but very elegant and masterful sumi, or ink, paintings. Here's one by Hakuin Ekaku, a famous Buddhist monk and Zen teacher who also happened to be a fantastic calligrapher and sumi artist. This is his portrait of the Buddha, known as Daruma in Japan. Nagasawa Rosetsu, another wonderful sumi painter, specialized in terrific paintings, almost portraits of animals. I love this giant bull with the tiny fuzzy little puppy down there by its mighty hoof. These are both from the 1600s. And if you think that bull reminds you more of Picasso than it does of Rembrandt, you're not far off. Japanese art had not yet become well known in the West, but it wouldn't be long, and it had a great effect on Western artists. Japanese woodblock prints in particular would become extremely popular in Europe and very important to the development of European art in the 19th century. And we can see their charm in this print by Suzuki Harunobu from the middle 1700s. Many of Harunobu's compositions represented slice-of-life moments that might remind you, in a way, of Dutch genre paintings, except Harunobu's often feature beautiful young women. He was extremely skilled in capturing fleeting moments and gestures of street and household life that would be familiar and appealing to a wide swath of the public. And the printmaking medium, of course, is another way of making artworks accessible to the public by making them reproducible and relatively inexpensive. Many more people could afford this print than could afford a gilded and hand-painted screen. Interesting that Japanese artists were figuring this out at about the same time as faraway European artists in the 17th and 18th centuries. This image of Harunobu's is an example of what are called floating world prints. The Japanese floating world means the pleasure quarters that existed in specified areas of pretty much every important city. These pleasure quarters included restaurants, bathhouses, and brothels, and the prints included images of popular actors and beautiful geishas. They also have an analogy in Dutch Baroque painting. They are related to those vanitas paintings that we saw in the Dutch Baroque period, in the sense that they aim to remind viewers that life is fleeting. But the Japanese floating world prints suggest a much more lighthearted solution to the problem. We'd better enjoy life while we can. Suzuki Harunobu was a great proponent of this genre of work. In this picture, he shows his young woman in a red cloak crossing the water on a reed. This feat is something that a Zen master was supposed to have done in legend, and the joke here is to portray a beautiful young woman doing this instead of a decrepit old Zen master. And there's an implication that enlightenment might as well come through seeking pleasure with a beautiful young woman as through rigorous Zen Buddhism. As I mentioned, this tradition of printmaking was to become very important in Japan through the 19th century, and as contact with the West became more frequent, Japanese printmaking would inspire many Western artists, such as Toulouse-Lautrec, Manet, Degas, Whistler, Van Gogh. I'd like to show you a little of what was going on in India while the Baroque was happening in Europe. What we now know as India was then part of the Mughal Empire, which spread from Afghanistan down through India from the north, bringing a Persian cultural influence to the subcontinent. Mughal rulers brought Persian masters to India, master artists, to teach Persian miniature painting to Indian painters, and this style spread throughout northern India. I have some great examples. This wonderful painting of a plane tree filled with leaves and squirrels was a collaboration between two artists of the Mughal court, Abul Hassan and Mansur. I chose it because we also happen to have a wonderful portrait of Abul Hassan, painted in the same year by a third artist named Dalat. We can see that Hassan was quite young when these were created, and I love the concentration that Dalat has captured as Hassan works on his own painting in the portrait. Hassan himself went on to specialize in portraiture, and it's striking to me that a similar interest in portraiture and the emphasis on the individual that we saw developing at about the same time in Europe is also developing in India. Here's another beautiful miniature painting showing that Persian influence. This one is called The Hour of Cowdust, and it's from the end of the 18th century. It shows Krishna. He's playing the flute down here in the lower right, bringing the sacred cattle home in the evening, while all the ladies of the village hang out the windows to admire him. Even the cattle here are treated with a beautiful individuality and a tender, close observation. We'll see some more parallels with Europe as we move on to China. This painting by Yin Hong, called Hundreds of Birds Admiring the Peacock, is from the late 15th or early 16th centuries, and you might compare this with the sort of court paintings, perhaps, that Rubens was doing in Europe. This painting is probably meant to be an allegory for the hundreds of court officials, these beautifully feathered birds around the margins here, admiring the emperor, the male peacock. Of course, in China, as in Europe, it was the imperial courts that could afford and patronize this kind of elaborate art. Within the next 100 years or so, a split was to develop in what had been a fairly monolithic approach to art in China. One school being labeled as orthodox and taking a somewhat more conservative approach that developed the traditional styles. Wang Hui was a proponent of that orthodox school, continuing the traditions of Sumi painting that had been established for many centuries in China. And you really see the traditional forms exquisitely achieved here, and a stunning use of atmospheric perspective in particular in his work. Another school arose, however, calling themselves the Individualist School, and the painter Shi Tao is a great example of the Individualists. His work looks absolutely modern to me. If you had told me that this piece, The House Beneath the Cliff, was painted yesterday, I would have easily believed you. Shi Tao is the forerunner of a very strong tradition now in Chinese Sumi painting, which takes the traditional strokes but puts them to completely new uses, as in this amazing painting of banks of mist floating among the peaks of these mountains. I love the way he's found to create these textures with his brush and to make the mist appear by carving it out of the white of the paper and painting everything else in around it. That tradition has continued through to modern times, with much Sumi painting now being completely abstract or using the discipline of the traditional strokes in ways that neither of these artists would recognize, but which Shi Tao, I think, at least might appreciate. This surge of individualism, this idea that artists could be and should be expressing a unique view of the world, came later in China than in Europe, but it has definitely come by this point. Well, after that whirlwind tour, I do want to go back to Europe, where we left the Baroque period running its course. You all know just what I mean when I say the Baroque period, right? I've talked in these lectures as if you could trace a straight line of development from Gothic to Proto-Renaissance to High Renaissance to Mannerist to Baroque. And I've mentioned the features of each of these periods and expected you to distinguish between them, haven't I? Sure, it's an oversimplification, but it's been a reasonable way up till now to organize and think about all that creative work. But that's all over now as we get into the late 18th century. The very fact that the world was beginning to open up, that travel, even transcontinental travel, was becoming an exciting possibility, meant that art, even in a relatively small region like Europe, was no longer going to develop in that fairly linear way that we've seen so far. The Baroque style itself would develop, or perhaps some would say deteriorate, into a movement called Rococo, which emphasizes the decorative aspects of the Baroque and found much of its most elaborate expression in architecture and sculpture. The word Rococo, like the word Baroque, remember, started out as a pejorative. It's a combination of the French rocaille, or shell, and the Italian barocco, or baroque, with the implication, I believe, that you got Rococo by taking Baroque and decorating it with seashells. Rococo architecture isn't just about decoration, of course. It takes that theatrical element of the Baroque for a quantum leap. It's decorated like a wedding cake, for sure, but look at the sculpted curtains here that frame the action in this fresco. They're built in, but they're conceived as part of the fresco. Sculpted curtains giving the effect that they're gold on one side and lined with white on the other, and not even symmetrical. They're sculpted to look as if they're just casually pulled back to reveal the scene. Neumann, the principal architect of the residence Würzburg, is having an awful lot of fun here. And at its best, Rococo architecture really can have that sense of fun. Here's another example of the blending of illusion. You can see at the top here the little putti. There are always putti in Rococo architecture. One of them is sculpted, but one is painted, so that it's really hard to tell where the fresco ends and the 3D ornamentation begins. And just look at this frame itself. More putti down here. And like those framing draperies we just saw, this is completely asymmetrical. It's an astonishing thing. It looks as if someone was trying to decorate it with a frosting tube and it wouldn't hold still. Strange to think that Zweifelden Abbey, also in Germany, was a Benedictine monastery at the time. Definitely fun to see this stuff, but it does make your teeth hurt a bit. And that's my feeling about the painters that worked in this style as well. Fragonard is a prime example. Here's a painting that draws you in with its skillful command of color and light, but uses those skills to give us a scene that's extremely saccharine. The painting was apparently commissioned by the gentleman in the lower left down here, who wanted Fragonard to pose him looking up his mistress's skirt. The commission was first refused by another painter, but Fragonard accepted it eagerly. He delighted in this kind of hint of eroticism, and here turns it into a joke by painting the sculpted Cupid with its finger to its lips, in case we haven't noticed the little secret. The best of the painters working in this Rococo style, at least in my opinion, is Antoine Watteau. He had an unconventional education. He was the son of a roofer and started by working as a copyist, cranking out popular image for mass consumption. And by his early 20s, he worked for artists who specialized in theater scenes and interior decoration. Thus, he became very accomplished at a very young age in the creation of charming, idyllic visions of life, which emphasized love and beauty. Watteau created plenty of his own pastel-tinted romances that are much more like the Fragonard we just saw, just the thing to decorate 18th century French interiors. But since he died very young, I think it's only fair that we look at his last and, to my mind, best painting. He'd been studying Rubens on his own, and who knows what he would have done, where he would have taken his impressive talents if he had lived longer. But he died at 36 or 37 of tuberculosis. This last of his paintings was actually created as a shop signboard, but the shop owner, it was an art shop, an art gallery, the shop owner realized what he had, and instead of hanging it outdoors, he sold it as a fine art painting. It shows a pair of very elegantly dressed 18th century couples being shown paintings in a fictitiously enlarged version of his art gallery, with many, many other paintings up there on the walls around them. You can see that this is related to the Kunstkammer paintings that we looked at in the last lecture. I love the light on these two women's dresses. I referred to Fragonard and Watteau as painters who worked in the Rococo style because not all painters were working in this light-hearted, ornamental idiom. And this is what you'll see increasingly if you take your study of art history on past the end of the 18th century, the 1700s, which is supposed to be where the purview of this class ends. More and more, styles will be extremely personal as well as reflective of the time and place. Chardin, for example, he painted quite a few genre paintings too, but he is really known for his still life paintings, and I think they are among the most breathtaking still life works ever created. They are just absolutely devoid of sentimentality. Nothing saccharine or romantic about these at all, just quiet, profoundly personal expressions of the way the world looks to him. You can see that he is standing on the shoulders of the Dutch Baroque painters and taking that style in a very different direction from the more typical Rococo that was happening all around him in Paris. There are several Chardin paintings in New York City in the Met. I hope you can see some of these in the flesh at some point. The last artist I want to look at should really drive home this idea that art is not going to be developing in that linear way anymore. You've probably picked up that I have trouble getting real excited about Rococo, but here's a painter and printmaker who was working at about the same time, the late 18th century, that I can get very excited about. Goya. Goya famously said that he had three masters: nature, Velázquez, and Rembrandt. In this early self-portrait, I think you can see the powerful visual aspects of Baroque painting, the chiaroscuro in particular. And in this later portrait of his wife, a softening of that drama, the more tender, intimate feeling of emotional communication that I really associate with Velázquez, and of course Rembrandt. Goya's first big commission was a series of cartoons for tapestries. These were created in the prevalent Rococo style, and they might help give an insight into the interestingly divided nature of Goya's body of work. These paintings, there were eventually 63, all showing scenes of attractive young people hunting, picnicking, dancing, were then woven as large tapestries, though the paintings were sold as paintings too. It was largely as a result of these cartoons that Goya became court portrait painter to the Spanish crown in 1786, walking in the footsteps of Anguissola and Goya's beloved Velázquez. We see Velázquez influence very strongly in this painting of the king's family. We even see him using a similar device as Velázquez used in Las Meninas, the maids-in-waiting, remember? With the artist himself shown working on the very painting that we're viewing. Velázquez had somewhat fallen out of fashion in the popular mind during this period, but Goya had access to a whole lot of his paintings since he worked in the Spanish court, and he studied them voraciously. Goya painted the court nobility as well. Here is a portrait of his friend Manuel Godoy, very reminiscent of Velázquez, I think. Godoy is suspected to have been the one who commissioned a pair of paintings that are certainly among Goya's most famous, the nude and clothed maja paintings. Maja being a Spanish term for a beautiful young woman of the lower class. The maja nude is considered to be the first life-size female nude in Western painting that is absolutely secular. There is no pretense that we are looking at an allegory or a religious scene or a mythological illustration. It was quite daring for its time, and in fact, the painting was confiscated from Godoy's private collection by the Inquisition some years later. Goya only escaped prosecution by testifying that he had been inspired by a Velázquez Venus in the royal collection, which was known to have been a favorite of Philip IV. The Maha clothed, painted a few years later, is exactly the same size, though the figure is painted larger. An early account claims that they were originally hung with the nude Maha underneath the clothed one, which could be raised by a pulley when the collector wanted to view his Maha nude. Whether that is true or not, they can be seen side by side in the Prado in Madrid today. By the time he painted the Maha paintings, Goya was suffering from an undiagnosed illness, which eventually cost him his hearing and had a profound effect on his mental health as well. He began leading almost a double life in his studio, creating very beautiful portraits for the court, but then in his own studio, creating much darker works. One of the earliest is this painting, The Lunatic Yard, which Goya said was a memory from his youth in Saragossa, and which certainly reflects not only his interest in reforming the treatment of the mentally ill, which was a growing movement in the European Enlightenment, but also his fears for his own mental health. Artists don't end their careers neatly at the end of the span of any art history class, and we're going to follow Goya into the 19th century. At the end of the century, Napoleon was about to declare war on Spain. Goya responded to the war with a series of etchings called the Disasters of War. Among them, this image of civilians struggling with soldiers. Other series of prints critique the violence, irrationality, and greed of Goya's own society in very bitter and dramatic terms. Here are two from a large series of 80 prints called Los Caprichos. One is titled The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters, that's the one on the left, and the other one is Out Hunting for Teeth. The title of the series, Caprices, suggests lighthearted jokes, but these are obviously anything but lighthearted. Goya released the series to the public, but later withdrew them from sale due to the growing power of the Inquisition. The Inquisition did not have much of a sense of humor. Their critique of his society might have made life very, very difficult for Goya, but it makes the prints feel extremely modern to us, I think. Goya did a lot of printing, and some of my favorites are in this late series of prints called Los Disparates, or The Follies. Goya left this series apparently incomplete when he left Spain for France after Napoleon's defeat. They were never published in his lifetime, thanks again to the Inquisition, but for me they include some of his strongest compositions, along with some of his strangest and most dreamlike imagery. We have a preparatory drawing for this one, The Furious Folly, which in its own way is just as beautiful as the print itself. I love the way Goya composes with tone in the etching, but the incredible skill and expression of his brush lines here is also so beautiful to me. It was also right after Napoleon's defeat that Goya created his amazing painting, The 3rd of May, 1808, which seems to me to unify in a way the two sides of his body of work. This painting was created at a time of transition and, unfortunately, false hope for Goya. Spain had been conquered by Napoleon Bonaparte, and when Bonaparte was defeated, the son of Goya's former patron, Ferdinand VII, who had been imprisoned in France by Bonaparte, was released and returned to power in Spain. Goya painted this painting, the 3rd of May, 1808, to commemorate a popular uprising in 1808 in support of the royal family, an uprising which had obviously been brutally put down by Napoleon's forces. In other words, Goya was hoping to welcome Ferdinand VII back to Spain with this painting, and hopefully reinstate himself under royal patronage. Unfortunately, Ferdinand VII turned out to be a reactionary whose rule was, if anything, more disastrous for Spain than Napoleon had been. He abolished the Constitution, he restarted the Spanish Inquisition, and Goya ended up first retiring into near isolation and finally fleeing to France, where he died in self-imposed exile several years later. I'm sad for his disillusionment, but so grateful that he gave us this remarkable painting. This would certainly be on my short list for one of the greatest paintings of the world. You'll see it when you go to the Prado to view those Mahas. Kind of incredible that they were painted by the same guy, isn't it? I can't tell you how inspiring this man's energy is to me. When Goya retired into isolation in a little house in the Spanish countryside, he was in his 70s. He covered the walls of that house with murals in oil paint. Some of the darkest paintings of his career, but oh my, these are powerful paintings, called his black paintings. They've been removed from the walls and are now in the Prado, obviously. There are 14 of these, several quite large. This one gives a very cynical view of the traditional Spanish religious pilgrimage to San Isidro, painting the pilgrims in a way that would make them fit right in to this witch's Sabbath, which is painted on a nearby wall. It seems pretty clear that Goya did not paint these for public consumption. He probably never imagined that they'd be removed from the walls and mounted in a museum. But they've had great relevance, great meaning for artists down through the centuries. Saturn eating his children is one you've likely seen before. Very famous image. Very difficult to associate this with the creator of those tapestry cartoons, isn't it? To me, it's inspiring to see that Goya's response to war, injustice, superstition, despite his illness, even mental illness, disillusionment, exile, was to create these works of art. May we all find the energy to respond so creatively to the challenges of our existence. Much as I love this painting, I don't think we'll end this last lecture with it. Let's end instead with this late self-portrait. I think Velázquez, and Rembrandt too, would have been proud to acknowledge the painter of this self-portrait as their pupil and follower. They'd love his skill with light and brushwork, but I think they'd love even more the way he puts it to use, to connect with us emotionally. Goya has been called the last old master painter and the first modern painter. So it seems fitting to end our quarter together with his work, and especially with this beautiful painting. So, I'll be quiet now and let you look. Thanks for listening.